Thank you for being here. We really appreciate you coming first thing in the morning. My name is Joshua Duttweiler. I'm an assistant professor of communication design at Texas State University. Also a researcher on the Chicano print project, which is exhibiting up the stairs to your right. Also, a graphic designer, and I live in Austin, Texas. So excited to be here in Pasadena today. Yeah, I can talk louder, or maybe we can work on the volume. Is it possible to get a little bit louder? Can we get the volume a little louder? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alexandria Cantrolla. I'm a communication design associate professor at Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi. I'm also a multidisciplinary artist, designer, and researcher specializing in visual storytelling, large-scale installations, and archival inquiry. And Josh and I have put together this panel as part of our research for Chicano in Print, which is an exhibition here at LA Art Book Fair.
Really quickly, before I introduce our guests, I want to just quickly define the Chicano movement. We're going to be talking a lot about that, but I just want everyone to be on the same page. So Chicano movement, or El Movimiento, was a social and political civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s that empowered Mexican Americans here in the U.S. to fight structural racism, gain political rights, and embrace national identity. It sought self-determination, better working conditions, educational equality, land reclamation, and was largely driven by youth activists and labor leaders, and centered largely in California and Texas. So our project, Chicano in Print, we've been studying the Chicano movement through the newspapers, which were printed by activists and various organizations who use that tool as a way to communicate the goals and of the movement, as well as kind of motivate people to take action. So our process thus far has been speaking to amazing archivists and activists who worked on the movement, as well as digging through the archives and looking at the newspapers. We both are trained as graphic designers, so the idea of like these publication designs are as like design artifacts and historical artifacts is also really interesting to us. So we've put together an exhibition that's been traveling the U.S. a little bit. We've also are working on a book that'll come out in like 2027. It's a long ways away. And so I'll let you go from there.
Yeah, so before we get started in speaking, we wanted to talk a little bit about the Chicano movement specifically. It emerged as part of and often in tension with the broader Chicano civil rights movement. Chicanos were writing, designing, and publishing their own newspapers at a time when they were fighting not only racism, but also sexism within their own communities. Titles like Hijas de Coronel and Encuentro Femenil are great examples of Chicano publications from this time period. In today's panel, we'll discuss the legacy of these materials, the women who made them, and their design and editorial choices. Most importantly, why they still matter for how we think about design, activism, and feminist print culture. I'm honored to be joined by two incredible guests who bring both lived history and archival expertise to this conversation. First, we have Anna, who is a pioneering Chicana writer and activist recognized for addressing issues affecting the Latinx community, including workers' rights, welfare rights, higher education, and more. In 1969, at age 23, she became the first woman president at the Chicano student movement of Aztlán, Mecha, a student organization that strove to create a society free of imperialism, sexism, racism, and homophobia. Around this time, she began working as an assistant professor at California State University in Northridge, where she directly challenged sexism and racism in her revolutionary curriculum. Por mi raza. In 1971, when Nieto-Gomez turned 25, she co-founded Hijas de Coronel, a feminist-centered publication dedicated to highlighting the struggles of Chicana issues, such as equal rights, childcare, reproductive rights, and the widening gender gap in poverty. And joining us as well is Angel Diaz, is the curator for the California Ethnic and Multicultural Archives and History of California and the American West in the Department of Special Research Collections. She's also the subject librarian for Chicana and Chicano Studies. She holds a master's degree in library and information science from UCLA and a master's degree in education for the University of San Francisco, as well as a BA in US history from the University of San Francisco. She has published and presented on the topics of labor, archival management, DEIA and special collections, and various topics related to the history and culture of California. Angel is active with and holds a leadership position with the Society of American Archivists.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. And to mention Angel's at UC Santa Barbara. I think that detail was missed. Appreciate you making the drive. So to kind of begin our time, I'll ask Angel to set the tone or give us a little bit of background. How do you situate the Chicano movement within the broader narrative of the Chicano movement, especially as it relates to print culture?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to take part and to be here with Anna. I feel very honored to be sitting next to you. We've communicated but never met in person, so that was exciting as well. So the Chicano movement, as they discussed, was coming up in the 1960s, late 1960s, and it was a student movement. So you saw the movement on college campuses, but also in communities, in high schools. We had the walkouts in East LA, the Chicano moratorium, which was an anti-Vietnam War effort, a call for equality, economic equality, a call against racism, and it should be noted that women were involved throughout. They were there, they were present, they were doing the work. In 1969, there were a couple of major Chicano student conferences, one in Denver and one in Santa Barbara. And this is when all of the various student groups, Mexican-American student groups, came together in this Chicano conference, and this is where we start to see the development of Mecha as an organization and your sort of el plan, right? Which laid out all of the demands for the Chicano movement. And what you're starting to see is the opposition of a recognition of the Chicanas, right? The Chicana does not want to be liberated, is one of the lines that comes out. And women who are, young women who are in the movement in leadership positions were starting to see the inconsistencies in the messaging, right? They were experiencing the inequality, the sexism from within the movement. And they had always been there organizing and were having these caucuses, right? Meetings to come together. And at Cal State Long Beach, we see the Hijas de Cuauhtémoc come together, the newspaper that is published in 1971. And it's the call for women to be recognized, women to be treated as equals, both within the Chicano movement and in the larger world that we're in. In relation to its print culture, well, newspapers were the sort of mode of communication of the time. They're a fairly inexpensive way to produce and spread your message. And it was a really great way for these student groups from different parts of the country, not just California and Texas, but all over Washington State, to send out their message and spread their message. And the Hijas de Cuauhtémoc was sort of this really important publication of that time of the Chicana feminist movement.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Angel. Anna, can you talk about how newspapers became a space of both resistance and self-definition for Chicanas?
Okay. My first experience using Chicana print to mobilize people into action came from my participation with La Raza newspaper in East Los Angeles. From 1967 to 75, La Raza functioned as a hub of resistance and a center of communication. La Raza taught me how a community newspaper can identify urgent local issues and build a collective awareness and mobilize people toward organized action. In the fall of 1969, La Raza gave me my chance to publicly voice concerns about women's status inside the movement. Around that time, the editors noticed that Chicanas were publishing essays in the Chicano press about inequities women experienced in the movement. This was especially striking development, given that at the first National Youth Chicano Conference in March 1969, a resolution was issued stating that Chicanas do not want to be liberated. To stir further debate regarding the women's question, the editors decided to publish a 2-page spread about La Mujer in November 1969. Then La Raza asked me to write a piece. I chose to write 2 poems. They were Somos Chicanas de Aztlán and Empieza la Revolución Verdadera. These poems rallied men and women to resume a genuine cultural democratic revolution, grounded in working together as equals for a shared cause. Those poems became my first deliberate effort to use Chicana print culture as a tool for political education and mobilization.
Thanks, Anna. This question is for either of you. So publications like Hijas de Cuauhtémoc and Encuentro Femenil were groundbreaking. And I would say, like, what made them distinct in both content and visual language?
Okay. The movement papers such as La Raza were part of the Chicano Press Association. They were hubs of social justice journalism, and they also distributed newspapers from the Midwest and Southwest. From these papers, the Hijas learned what other Chicanas were learning, were thinking, writing, and doing. Our readings revealed a growing Chicana feminist print culture from California to Milwaukee, where essays, poetry, graphic art, and commentary confronted gender discrimination and patriarchal leadership within the movement. These publications broke our isolation and made clear that we were part of a broader public debate. We discovered that Chicanas were building a Chicana press that treated women's education, women's work, women's daily life as political issues. And it showed women as leaders, organizers, intellectuals, poets, and artists for social justice. For the Hijas, this was emotionally and politically transformative. It strengthened a collective identity and moved us from educating ourselves to organizing ourselves. As a result, the Hijas launched the Chicana Feminist Press, an independent entity. We normalized breaking the silence. We rallied Chicanas to dissent, to advocate and to act, to hold leaders and decision makers accountable. In addition, we transformed our culture by challenging stereotypes, documenting women's accomplishments, and highlighting the diversity of Chicana intellectual thought. And at a time when few books existed about La Chicana, the Hijas helped build an infrastructure of knowledge for starting the new discipline of Chicana studies. We left also an archive that continues to shape how Chicanas' resistance and self-definition are understood today. The Hijas newspaper was also a radical in its visual communication. We used design and imagery to announce Chicana feminist urgency. For example, its masthead, Hijas de Cuauhtémoc, commands attention through its unusual length and spelling. Set in an inverted arch across the top of the page, in extra large, bold, Gothic black letters, the masthead has a dramatic and commanding presence. The visual language also rejected the lingering stereotype of the innocent, protected Indian maiden. In sharp defiance, the first issue of Hijas, An Encuentro Femenil, featured a graphic by Hector Villa, an artist who at the time was incarcerated at Terminal Island Prison. His graphic introduced a powerful, muscular, militant woman freedom fighter, trapped beneath a massive fishing net with a machete in her hand, ready to cut herself free. She embodied women determined to free themselves from the net of oppression. Much of the paper's artwork was created by Chicana art students at Cal State Long Beach. Rather than decorating the pages, their images functioned as political feminist statements and as an entry point to Chicana thought, which is new. It's commonplace now, but it didn't exist then. Making clear that Chicanas had something urgent and necessary to say. For example, when you see it, you'll see, what's her name? Maria Hortensia Garcia's graphics. And her graphics confront the realities of women workers navigating the chaos of sexual politics. Jeanette Padilla's work insists on the centrality of the United Farm Workers struggle. And another piece offers a bold geometric interpretation of the self-centeredness of Chicanos de Aztlán. Taken together, the visuals were new and innovative, politically incisive, and ahead of their time.
Yes. I think I just wanted to add to that there are two things that the graphics, the art, the poetry, they take up whole pages, and they are, the purpose is to express that political and social message. And this was a time when the thought of intersectionality didn't exist, but it is what Chicanas were fighting for, right? And another important part of the publication is the republication of poetry, of conference proceedings, so that, again, this message could be spread. You know, this Hijas de Cuauhtémoc was published in Long Beach, but Chicanas in Houston were reading it, and the messages were being passed back and forth, like social media. And so in my job at UCSB, I work with students a lot. Students come into the archives, and this publication is one that I like to bring out a lot, even though, as I said, like, every time a student touches it, I'm just like, it's falling apart. But it's really important for young people to see it and to recognize kind of the work that went into it. And it's very clear from the get-go. They're like, oh, they had to gather everyone's art, everyone's poetry, and print it. And that's something that is sort of clear upon your encounter with the paper.
Anna, could you share how did Chicanas challenge gender roles within movement spaces that were themselves fighting oppression? Were there tensions between Chicano nationalism and Chicano feminism?
No. In Mecha, Chicanas were often silenced, subtly, mostly openly. In meetings, we were denied the basic right to contribute. We raised our hands, and we were ignored. If we spoke anyway, the men were silent. Then they continued as if we had said nothing. Often a man would repeat the same point a woman had introduced earlier, and then suddenly it was a great idea. Over time, we learned we were only heard when we confronted the men directly, aggressively. So we decided to get their attention. When we would try to speak out and we were ignored, we would slammed the table. And then we would call them MFers and demanded that they hear our ideas. Only then would the group acknowledge the idea and consider it for a vote. We called ourselves Chicanas de Aztlán before we were Hijas de Guatemoc. Chicanas de Aztlán came into being when Mecha tried to silence women by having them voice their ideas in a separate space outside of Mecha. For example, in the fall of 1969, after a meeting, the Mecha president called me into his office and he asked me to interpret what other women had said. He said, "Anna, what did Norma mean when she said this? And what did Marta mean when she said that?" And I said, "I have no idea. You're going to have to ask them themselves. I don't speak for them." Then he changed his tactics and asked me to organize an orientation committee for women and advised that the women bring their questions to that committee rather than raise them in the Mecha meetings. I agreed without stopping to ask why there was an orientation committee for women but not for men. We formed the committee, named it Chicanas de Aztlán. Our goals were to share information about the civil rights movement and to develop leadership skills and experience. And very quickly, it became a consciousness-raising space where we discussed the forms of discrimination that we encountered on campus and inside the organization. When we took those concerns back to the Mecha president, he rarely supported our suggestions. That is, unless he needed us for something, like cooking to raise funds or helping to administer a conference. Still, as a quasi-independent women's group, we had more influence than we did as an isolated individual members. Chicanas de Aztlán also challenged the curriculum of Chicano studies. We asked, why didn't Chicano studies include Chicana history? The response we heard was blunt. There is no such thing. Women don't have a history because they don't make history. So we did our own research. I went into the library stacks and found books on the 1910 Mexican Revolution and found authors who included the chapters on women's roles. In that process, we discovered that a group named Hijas de Guatemoc had been a revolutionary feminist political organization that pressed for women's rights to vote. This convinced us that feminism was part of our history, was part of Chicana history. And so in 1970, the Chicanas de Aztlán changed our names to Hijas de Guatemoc. Then in 1971, we allied with women from the other universities and successfully pressed Chicano studies to include a Chicana studies curriculum as part of its major.
So Anna touched on this really nicely by talking about her own archival work. And Angel, obviously you know that topic very well. I was curious if you might share a little bit more about what you think the role of archive is in shaping kind of how the Chicana movement is understood today. Do archives function more as sites of preservation or spaces where narratives are actively negotiated? And then how do you approach archives that may already kind of reflect the gender bias that we've been talking about?
So to the question of what role do archives play in shaping how the Chicano movement is understood today? Well, yeah, like you already made the transition, but Anna and her, her compañeras in school, they looked back in history for inspiration, and that's where they got Guatemoc from. And so the importance of the archive is to help. One of the important parts of the archive is to help inspire right? And to learn from the stories of the people that came before us, from our elders, to use that as we move forward in whatever movement we're in. And archives, yeah, your sort of general traditional archives are sites of preservation for records. And, you know, in my job, I try to reach out to people and encourage them to bring their materials to UCSB, where we have facilities to preserve things. But I think it's also important to think about archives in the community. The archives that one keeps at home and shares with their family members, shares with their community, the oral histories, the traditions of oral history, and how important that is for communities to maintain those histories and to keep them, and as they continue, you know, their efforts. So archives can look any different way, many different ways, and they can, you know, look like newspapers, and they could look like the stories that we hear and bring forward. How do you approach archives that may already reflect gender bias? Well, archives come with all kinds of biases. I choose to bring in a collection because I like it sometimes, you know? And so it's important to look for all the voices, and look for the voices that are not heard when you're working through materials and you're working through stories, and people's stories. And I think the archive isn't just sort of, the materials are just sitting in a box. All kinds of people are coming in and engaging with it, and there's, I think this goes to your next question around exhibitions, which is sort of allowing the archive to get activated, to have people encounter it, and to facilitate new stories and new activities with those materials. There you go.
Can I add, since this is becoming an archive as well, let me add a little bit more about the tensions between Chicano nationalism and Chicana feminism. Kind of give you a historical situation. I joined the United Mexican American Students, we called UMAS, at Cal State Long Beach in spring 1968. At that time, UMAS operated as a civil rights organization with a democratic, collaborative structure. It felt revolutionary because women and men had an equal voice. This stood in sharp contrast to the broader social expectations in general society, when employers routinely offered men high-paying jobs because they were presumed smart, competitive, and natural leaders, while women were steered towards lower-paying work because they were congenial and attractive. And you could see that in the newspaper. The jobs were segregated, right, for men and for women. And you could see what are the qualifications: congenial and attractive. The men, smart, leadership. In UMAS, however, roles and responsibilities were assigned according to organizational needs rather than rigid sex roles. The movement demanded initiative. People became self-starters. They taught themselves new skills and attempted work they had never imagined possible. In that environment, women like me were encouraged to become leaders, public speakers, scholars, and organizers. These opportunities, I doubt, would have been offered to me outside of the movement. However, within a year, the rise of cultural nationalism reshaped those earlier civil rights values and practices, and in walked Darth Vader. UMAS changed its name to MECHA, and attitudes towards women shifted. Women were no longer accepted as leaders or equals. Instead, we were expected to subordinate our skills and abilities and to advance the priorities of the male leadership. I experienced this as a turn of regressive and dangerous times because it threatened to erase the ground we had gained as equal participants. So it's within this context, at a time when women mentioning women's rights was taboo, and if you talked about women's rights, it was treated as an act of disloyalty, that the Hijas published the first Chicana feminist press. And this paper opened a discourse on gender equality and made visible this cultural war that was simmering inside the movement. Thus, Hijas was punished also for breaking this taboo. Mecha members burned our newspaper. They staged a mock funeral in which Hijas were buried. And I was hanged in effigy.
If I could add, because I wasn't very specific in my last thing. But so it's like, we have these, we hear about the Chicano movement, and we hear about sort of the leaders and the sort of the big idea, and when we're looking through archives, that's where we're going to see the stories, the meeting minutes, the back and forth, and the documentation and the oral histories of this action where an effigy of Anna was burned, like literally. So that is where that is why the archive is important, so that we could remember this and not sort of forget that in the fog of the Chicano movement.
Yeah, I think that leads us to our last question for today, and that is, if there's one misconception about the Chicana movement that you wish you could correct, what would it be?
In 2016, I went to a reception celebrating the release of the film No Más Bebés, which tells the story of a little-known but landmark event in reproductive justice. And I went to a reception celebrating the movie coming out. And there, I met a woman in passing, and I said, "Hi, I'm Anna Nieto-Gomez." And she says, "Oh, I remember you. You were a man-hater." And I said, "No, I was not a man-hater. I advocated for equal rights for both men and women. It's the Chicano movement that weakened itself by opposing the self-determination of women and thereby of the whole of the community." So that's the misconception that still continues to this day, that we were man-haters. But I must say that we experienced a lot of hate. So it wasn't woman hating, it was more like hating for coming out of your place.
I think to that, the Chicana movement is not over. We're still learning a lot about the injustices that women faced while being in the movement, by men and by women, and that also the sort of the Chicano movement, led the way for the Chicanx movement that we're in. We'll leave it at that.
Other misconceptions. The Santa Barbara Archive has a fantastic. What a different. The Santa Barbara Archive has a fantastic archive. The Francisca Flores Comisión Femenil, and many Chicanas have benefited from that archive. And then they come to me and they interview me, and they asked me a lot of questions. And the question is, what I want to let you all know is that as a researcher, the more you know, the more I can tell you. The less you know, the less I can tell you. So that archive really prepares people to just begin to explore what was going on. But one of the misconceptions that the Chicanas have when they come and interview me is that they see these pictures of these women. La Comisión Femenil was not a student movement. Comisión Femenil was a movement of women, working women. And by the time I met them, I was 20, they were 40 or 50 or 60 years old. And they had been in the movement since the 50s, all right? And these are women that grew up during the Depression. They would go, they could tell you stories of their brothers or them going to the LA railroad yards and taking the food from the boxcars to feed themselves. So they lived a life of trial. And in spite of that, these women, they strove, they overcame, and they became workers. They worked in the factories, and they came up, they worked in the garment industries, and eventually left because they got hurt. They were secretaries or started in the office, but they never got further than clerks. Very few of them even became secretaries. But they did well, you know, and their husbands also came from the same story, and they did well. They were postmen. Some of them even became lawyers. Even some of the Chicanas became lawyers. Eventually, they put their husbands to work, and then they became lawyers. But what I'm trying to say is that you see the archives, and you see these women, and they're at the banquet celebrating their accomplishments. And then the young students who want to be revolutionary, they see these women and they judge them as middle class. Why? Because the loyalist Chicanas, the pseudo-feminist loyalist Chicanas, judged them, called them as middle class, so poo-poo. That's another way to poo-poo you. And I say, you know, question what you read. And the literature is not black and white. You know, there were women who saw the women's movement as contrary to their goals as well. They were in the what I call the loyalist faction, which is very diverse too. That's not black and white either. But so that the archive includes both thinkings, points of view. And I just wanted to point out that these pictures are of women who are in their best, their Sunday best. I'm disturbed that they are judged. They fall for that psychological trap. It's like saying, oh, you're a woman's liberal. Oh, well, you're middle class. So you just totally negate their accomplishments and their thinking.
Thanks all. Really appreciate it. I think we have like 4 minutes left, so I don't know if there's like a question from the audience. We can do that. Anyone?
I'm sorry, like I don't know you personally. So why did you both choose to do research on Chicana print?
I don't think we started with Chicana print necessarily. We were looking at the whole movement at large. My story actually begins with Angel, because I was teaching graphic design history in South Texas, and the curriculum we were using was like very Eurocentric, and I was teaching in a Hispanic serving institution, and so it was really interested in kind of just finding more design history stories. I knew about the Chicano movement loosely. I knew about the posters because they were like a very like easy graphic design object to kind of like understand and represent to students. And I went to the archive at UCB, or UCSB, to look at the posters specifically, and then Angel was like, oh, hey, there's this box of newspapers if you wanted to look at that too. I was like, okay, sure. And that kind of just opened up this world of like, yeah, just like more, because there's a ton of them. B, they're like immensely vast in their like visual styles and representations. And then they are also just like records of like stories, and stories have been visualized. And so that has just like led to a lot of things to research.
Around the same time, I think this was around 2020, Josh and I were asking a lot of questions about disinformation and journalism, and if there were maybe examples from previous history that kind of dealt with this. I grew up in South Texas, right on the border, and so I was visiting the archives at the university there, and I came upon newspapers, El Cuhamil, which was a South Texas newspaper in the 60s and 70s, and it was really strange for me to read these histories from where I grew up, and to feel like some of these stories, like the headlines weren't maybe too dissimilar from what I was reading today, and I really felt very connected with the material.
Okay, I think we'll wrap with that. I want to thanks again Anna and Angel for spending the morning with us, making the trek out here. I know I learn a lot every time I listen to you all talk. I will say, or I would invite everyone to go up to the Chicano print exhibition on the second floor there to the right. The cover is reproduced via de Cuauhtémoc, that Anna was really so kindly describing the visuals for, so you can take a peek at that. We also have produced kind of our own newspapers that act as the exhibition guide. Love you to grab a copy of that, and there's some really nice writing from other folks who have contributed to this project as well. So thank you all for being here today.
Can I add that
Oh, yeah.
There's 3 issues of Hijas de Cuauhtémoc, and they've been digitized. So once you go up there, look them up so that you can go home and look at them in detail.
Yeah, thanks all.